Hey everyone, it's Michelle.
And Steph.
And welcome back to the Inspired Podcast, a podcast hosted by UVic's Inspire program, which focuses on STEM for social impact. This season, we're stepping beyond the syllabus and engaging in conversations with some of your favorite professors.
Today, we have Dr. Michael Reed, whose research focuses on early medieval Western Europe and who has won a number of Excellence in Teaching Awards. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Reed. We're going to start right away with our first question.
So Steph and I are both in STEM programs, and for many of us, particularly for students in engineering, there isn't a lot of space allocated in our schedules to take electives outside our degree program. You're a humanities professor, and you've spoken before about how important it is to have an interdisciplinary education. Can you talk about why students in STEM should take humanities courses?
I think you need to kind of step back and think about knowledge in general. So in the broadest sense, there is the quantifiable and the qualitative. So the quantifiable, literally what we can measure. So we can measure something about flora and fauna. We can measure something about celestial phenomena. We can measure something about chemicals. We can measure something about sea levels, and so on. The qualitative is different, because the qualitative is subjective. It is opinion. It's emotion. And I think often science exists, or the perception is, that science exists in a realm that is somehow entirely objective and removed from a human experience. Science really only exists because the human experience directs it. What is it that society wants? What is it that society wants to improve? So the two have to have a conversation. You know, one of the interesting analogies is we might have the technology to clone, but is that really a good idea? Ethics tell us whether or not that particular scientific process is a good idea. So we need to think about how the humanities, the qualitative, and the sciences, the quantitative, have a very intimate dance. And if we approach a post-secondary education only by looking at one of those fields, then we are literally graduating with a proverbial half a deck. We can't really call ourselves enlightened, informed people if we're only thinking quantitatively, or if we're only thinking qualitatively. So building on your question, not only is it important for a STEM student to take a humanities course, it's absolutely critical for a humanities student to take a science. We need to have that balance. And we need to have that balance in order to really build those robust analytical skills that are going to take us into the next century and take graduates into the workforce. And if you don't have that, you're not going to be successful.
That's interesting because that balance is related to something we talk a lot about in the Inspire program. Specifically, we talk a lot about using empathy when designing technology. Can you give us your thoughts about the importance of understanding users when designing impactful solutions? And how might we be more effective in integrating empathy into STEM programs?
I would approach that question by thinking, what again is the purpose of STEM? What is the purpose of science, technology, engineering, and math? And the purpose is to make a lived experience better. So it's not about some esoteric search for the largest prime number. That might be something that inspires some people. But the point of STEM is to make a lived experience better for everyone. As such, empathy is integral because if you can't understand what someone else needs, or if you can't understand what their lived experience is, then how can you possibly adapt science in such a way so that it makes their life better? We need to remember that empathy is something that is very, very multifaceted. So we can't have a default person who we're aiming science at and saying, well, if we understand that particular person, and just by default, that person is probably going to be a straight, white, cisgendered male. That's not enough. because in terms of understanding the totality of society, we need to think about that plurality of voices. We need to think about women's voices and queer voices and indigenous voices, neurodiverse voices, and so on. And how can science adapt to make their lives better? Because I'm not convinced that those lived experiences are similar enough to warrant a singular approach to science.
That's actually a very interesting thing that Dr. Damien, who's the founder of the Inspire program, has mentioned quite a few times about what happens exactly when someone's designing a solution and doesn't take in diverse perspectives. So one of the examples that she gave was that until women got onto the design team for these like health apps, there was no period tracker because they didn't think that that was something useful because they weren't considering women's perspectives.
The other thing that I'd just like to mention, since this kind of links to it, are the stereotypes that we associate with STEM and the stereotypes that we associate with the humanities. I think also we need to define the humanities in a more broad sense, because on many campuses, many of the academic units that at UVic are situated in fine arts are also part of the humanities. So history of art, creative writing, and so on. So I think we need to think about the humanities in a more broader sense. However, that overarching stereotype is that STEM is the purview of males, the masculine, and the humanities, the purview of the feminine, the female. And that is still very, very loud on university campuses. And we still see that gender imbalance in terms of enrollment, certainly in terms of faculty, and also in terms of research interests. And that's something else we need to do at an institutional level. We need to redress this stereotype, which is very limiting, because we risk developing this notion that if a woman, for example, chooses to major in STEM, she will be inherently disadvantaged. And maybe she should be encouraged to move into another faculty. And that, of course, is not only inherently misogynist, but it's placing value judgments on who can perform well in what discipline. And that's something we need to be very, very aware of and deconstruct on a daily basis. So that's something that I think we also need to acknowledge, this gender stereotype. Stereotypes are never helpful. They just create base, flat characters, and they remove the individual from the equation. So I think we need to think about science and humanities from a much more individual perspective. What does your lived experience bring to this study that allows you to shine and allows you to think about information in new and interesting ways?
You know, it's so interesting how you're talking about how a person's lived experience can bring something new to the table. You're a researcher, so we wanted to ask what you think about how a researcher's lived experience and identity shapes their observations, and does this influence the evolution of scientific fields?
I can certainly speak to how my lived experience impacts my own research. I don't know if I'm equipped to speak to how it impacts scientific fields. I can hypothesize, but I don't know if I have a definitive answer. So I'll begin by saying how my lived experience impacts my own research. I'm a gay male, and I've been an out gay male since I was 23. So I've been out for 32 years. And I'm also a medievalist. My area of special interest is late Anglo-Saxon sculpture, something very specific. Sculpture in England between roughly the 10th and 11th centuries. My training is in the history of art and also archaeology. When I look, for example, at the material culture of a cathedral, and I look at the way a cathedral is ornamented and decorated, I often focus on funerary markers because that's my area of special interest. And there are many instances when we have what are called brasses. And brasses are a particular kind of funerary marker that we find built into the floor of cathedrals. And as the name implies, they're made of brass. And they will often have a low relief cast image of the deceased. And there are some medieval brasses that are couples. Often you can clearly see a male and a female. Usually an elite man, an elite woman who were benefactors of the church, and because of their wealth and status, they were rewarded by being interred in a very specific place in the cathedral. However, there are some brasses that depict men. And there have been ongoing debates in the context of medieval studies and medieval art history. Are we maybe seeing two brothers? Are we seeing two monks? Are we seeing two priests? I look at it from a different perspective. And I wonder aloud, are we seeing a couple? Are we seeing a couple that was able to negotiate an existence in the Middle Ages, probably through privilege, probably through wealth, probably through birth, and were able to have a final resting place together? That is an opinion that is not universally supported in my field, but it is corroborated with some textual accounts. So sometimes it takes a specific lived experience to see something or hypothesize something in an evidential category. Now, if I take that idea and apply it to science, I imagine there are similar instances when someone with a very specific lived experience has looked at a category of evidence and seen it in a new way. And that lived experience reveals something. It reminds me kind of a Aristotelian demonstration, a process of revealing knowledge based on observed truths. So I imagine that in STEM, a woman, a visible minority, might also view evidence in a very specific way that only their lived experience can reveal. So I sometimes wonder if rather than being critical of the lens of lived experience, because we're moving in that direction, we're moving in a direction where many people are becoming quite critical of lived experience as a lens through which we view the world. Maybe we should have the courage to step back and ask, what can lived experience actually do for us? What can lived experience actually reveal that helps deconstruct various societal hegemonies? So again, that personal experience that I can apply as a gay male, I can't apply it to science because I'm not a scientist, but I certainly imagine that there are very similar instances when someone can see evidence in a unique way simply because of who they are and how society treats them and perceives them.
Wow, this has been so interesting, but I also want to ask you about your role as a teacher. You've won quite a number of teaching awards.
I have. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, how do you conduct yourself as a professor? Like, how do you craft your teaching style to hear students and to help students?
I'll begin by saying, when my academic career began, I was very much on a funded research trajectory. So I was funded as a doctoral student. As soon as I finished my PhD, I immediately received a SSHRC postdoctoral fellowship that took me from England to Toronto for 2 years, where I undertook a major research project. I then came to UVic with another research award. And when I was here with that second research award, I met someone very influential, Alain Kaz, I hope you're listening, Elaine. She was the person who hired me and said, you need to teach. And I was somewhat hesitant because after completing my PhD in Britain, I didn't graduate with many teaching skills because the British system doesn't provide that to their doctoral students. You're there to complete a research project, and when you're done, goodbye. My saving grace was that as an undergraduate, I began my career in education. So I always thought I was going to be a teacher. So I had those foundational skills. When Alain gave me the opportunity to teach, I realized that this is something that speaks to me very, very loudly. And the classroom, for me, has become a laboratory where ideas can be tested. My teaching approach is dialectical, so it's a conversation. It really builds on, I guess, if you want to go back to the ancient world, kind of a Socratic approach to learning. The Socratic method is about asking questions that are intended to reveal insight, reveal information. So in my classrooms, there's a lot of talking. And I always encourage my students not to take notes because all of the foundational information will end up on Brightspace anyways. So let's take the opportunity during class to use our kind of PowerPoint as a guide to shape our conversation. And in addition to that, I build into all of my classes collaborative investigation and collaborative assignments so that people are always working together like a scientific laboratory to reveal some kind of synthesis, to reveal the something new that comes out of that dialectic. I'll also be completely honest. I discovered I absolutely love to perform. So my classes are very much, I imagine from the student's perspective, entertaining, but I love being in front of a crowd. And I've discovered at this stage in my career that if academia didn't work for me, I would probably be an actor or a comedian. I have this need to interact with groups of people. So unlike most profs, I don't like small classes. I love the big ones. I like having 200 students. For me, in a large lecture theater with 200 students, I'm on. And that's what I adore. That's what I love. That's when I'm alive. I breathe when I'm in front of that many people. So I guess my teaching is all about conversation. It's all about finding the joy in learning. And also from my own selfish perspective, it's finding the joy in teaching. Because teaching is, in my humble opinion, an art. We can go to the Faculty of Education like I did all those years ago, and you can learn the fundamentals. So you can learn how to design a lesson plan, and you can learn how to deliver a solid lecture. You can learn how to question your students effectively, and so on. But teaching also is magic, and the magic is something that is either there or it isn't. It's hard to cultivate. And usually the magic is something you find in you after you've taught for a few years. If you just allow it to come out, that's when you're really sharing part of you, part of your lived experience, part of your reaction to learning at the university experience and so on with your students. So you're building that rapport. And all I can say is that for me, teaching is something more than conveying information. It's about revealing information and building a rapport in a classroom that is significant and lasting. And I hope it's impactful. I always make a point of ensuring that my students know that I'm an out gay man. And I am amazed, constantly amazed, by how many students over the years have felt comfortable enough to come out to me because of that. That's pretty special when they feel safe enough to do that. So I feel kind of obligations to my students. I have obligations to myself to enjoy what I do. And I think when it all works, it's literally capturing, magic in a bottle. And I'm just very fortunate that I've been able to do it. It truly makes my heart sing. And that isn't meant to be some kind of, trite comment. It really is. It's something that makes me smile every day. And when I come to work, I'm always happy because I know this is where I want to be.
Okay, so we're coming up on the end of this episode, and this has been such a lovely conversation. Is there anything else you want to mention or reiterate before we close out?
The approach that our university and many universities in Canada take to education in general, it relates to this idea of what I call balkanizing education. Mm-hmm. So the humanities live on one side of a campus, the sciences live on another, the fine arts are on the periphery, and so on. That is completely contrary to certainly a historical approach to learning. And we can trace that back to the Middle Ages. But even in a not too distant past, so the earlier part of the 20th century, many people were still taking what they called an arts and science curriculum, where mathematics, physical sciences, philosophy, literature, they were all constituent components of a degree program. Again, blending the qualitative and the quantitative. In my humble opinion, the past is the future in that sense. Because if people graduate with that toolbox that includes qualitative facility and scientific facility, not only are they going to be more employable, they're going to be better citizens. They're going to be better people. And we need to remember that the university has two roles: to create citizens, but also to give you those marketable skills to get a job. We need to do better. And I think the idea of being exclusively a STEM person or exclusively a humanities person, that doesn't carry weight anymore, in my humble opinion. So every STEM student needs to take some humanities courses, and every humanities student needs to take some science. And I'm very proud to say that in my humanities courses, we spend time thinking about Bacon, thinking about the scientific method, thinking about Copernicus, thinking about heliocentrism, thinking about Kuhn, thinking about paradigm shifts. I bring science into my humanities courses. Some students accept it kicking and screaming, but they need it. We need to have a broad approach to learning and knowing. And if we continue to, again, prioritize these very specific degree paths, we are doing a disservice to our students.
Definitely. I mean, I totally agree with you. We want to thank you so much for being here. And we want our listeners to know that Dr. Reid teaches many fascinating courses in art history and visual studies, medieval studies, and the humanities.
Thank you to everyone listening to the Inspired at UVic podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode for an interview with Dr. Trevor Bazette. Bye.
Bye.